It begins, as many unsettling discoveries do, with something ordinary. A key. A basement door. The simple act of turning a handle. He had not expected anything remarkable, certainly not something that would unmake every certainty he held about his family's past. Yet that is the nature of history's hidden corners, they do not ask permission before they reveal themselves. The house had been closed for years, tucked away at the edge of town where few people bothered to visit. It belonged to a relative long deceased, a man whose name was only faintly remembered in family stories and who left no children of his own. The place carried the unmistakable scent of abandonment, stale air heavy with dust, wood swollen with time, and wallpaper peeling into curled strips like parchment left too long in firelight. Most would have walked away, dismissing the home as nothing more than an empty relic. But curiosity has always been a dangerous companion. The basement door was half hidden behind an old bookshelf, its hinges rusted, its frame shrouded in cobwebs. When he pulled it open, a rush of cold air escaped, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. The steps descending below were steep, narrow, and irregular, carved from stone that bore the marks of centuries. Each creak of his weight carried downward into silence, swallowed by the darkness waiting below. There is something about basements that unsettles even the most rational mind. They are spaces designed to be beneath, out of sight, repositories of what should be forgotten. In old houses, they become archives of neglect, trunks, broken furniture, stacks of paper yellowed by time. Yet in this house, what waited below was not the clutter of the mundane. It was something altogether different. His lantern cut through the shadows, casting long trembling shapes against stone walls. At first, he thought the walls were marked with stains or peeling plaster. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized these were frames. Dozens of them. Wooden, iron, some ornate, others crude. All fixed directly into the walls, as though the basement itself had been designed as a gallery. And within each frame, staring outward with uncanny intensity, were faces. Photographs. They were not random portraits of forgotten strangers. They were, unmistakably, his own family. Or at least, they should have been. The first image he approached was that of a man in sepia tone, dressed in the sober fashion of the late 1800s. The face was familiar, the slope of the brow, the curve of the jaw, even the faint shadow beneath the eyes. He recognized it, because it was his own. Not similar, not reminiscent, but identical. His hand trembled as he moved to the next frame. A woman this time, photographed in the early 1900s, her hair pinned in the style of the era. She too bore his face. The same set of eyes. The same shape of lips, softened slightly but undeniable. Frame after frame, the pattern repeated, children, adults, elderly men, solemn women, captured in different decades, different fashions, yet every one of them bearing the same face that now stood, staring back, alive and trembling in the dim lantern light. Panic clawed at his chest. He told himself it was impossible. Family resemblance could be strong, yes, perhaps too strong at times. But this? This was no resemblance. This was replication. The deeper he looked, the more relentless the repetition became. There was a photograph of a soldier in uniform, dated around the First World War. Another of a young boy holding a wooden toy, his expression both innocent and haunting. A stern-faced farmer beside a mule, weathered by sun and time. And in each, the same face stared back, suspended in history like a reflection caught across decades. A chill swept through him, not from the cold stone but from the unnatural recognition pressing upon his mind. Who had placed these photographs here? And why hide them in a basement where no casual visitor would ever stumble upon them? One frame in particular drew him closer. It was larger than the rest, its glass cracked, its edges tarnished with corrosion. Inside was the portrait of a man sitting rigid in a chair, dressed in dark formal attire, hands clasped, eyes fixed with a severity that pierced through the haze of age. Beneath the portrait, in neat script, was a name, Elias. A relative he had never heard mentioned in any family story. Yet the man's face was his own, so precisely mirrored that he recoiled. Whispers seemed to echo in the silence, though he knew no one else was there. He became aware of his own heartbeat, loud and uneven, as though trying to flee from within his chest. The air pressed heavier with each breath, as if the basement itself demanded acknowledgement of what he was seeing. He turned to leave, but something compelled him to glance once more. That was when he noticed it. In the farthest corner, almost hidden behind a sagging beam, was a final photograph. This one lacked a frame, the edges curling as though it had been torn hastily from an album. It was more recent than the others, the colors still intact, the paper not yet yellowed. And it showed him. Not a relative, not a twin from another century, but him. Same clothes, same hair, the same tired lines etched into his face. It was as though someone had taken his photograph without him ever realizing it, and placed it here, among the others who bore his likeness. For a long moment, he could not breathe. The lantern flickered, shadows shivering across the walls of identical faces, countless eyes watching him with a unity that felt almost alive. In that instant, he understood something dreadful. This was not discovery. This was inheritance. And there, in the basement, surrounded by versions of himself stretching back through time, he realized the most terrifying question was not how they all looked the same. It was whether he, too, was destined to become another photograph on that wall. Every mystery is anchored in a place. A location that becomes not merely a backdrop but a character in its own right. For this story, that place was a house. At first glance, it was ordinary, another weathered home on the margins of a small southern town. But to those who stepped inside, its silence was not the silence of vacancy. It was the silence of secrets, pressed into every nail, woven into the grain of its wooden beams, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The house had stood for more than a century. Built in the final years of the 19th century, it bore the fingerprints of an era when homes were crafted not just for shelter but as monuments to permanence. Its foundation was of stone quarried from nearby hills, its timbers cut from ancient forests long since vanished. Tall windows overlooked the land, though most had been boarded for decades, their glass fractured by storms and years of neglect. Family stories insisted the house had once been filled with life. It was said to have hosted gatherings where music spilled through the windows, and children's laughter echoed down its halls. Neighbors remembered the smell of bread baking in the kitchen hearth, the sight of oil lamps flickering in the parlor long after nightfall. But those were memories from generations past. In recent decades, the home became less a dwelling than a relic, unvisited except by dust and decay. Step inside, and the air changed. The first breath one took was heavy, carrying with it the scent of mildew, smoke long faded, and something harder to place, the faint sweetness of rot clinging to the walls themselves. Wallpaper, patterned with roses and vines, had peeled away in curling sheets, revealing plaster cracked like a dried riverbed. The floorboards sagged in places, giving beneath a cautious step, as if reluctant to hold weight any longer. Yet even in ruin, the house carried a presence that unsettled. There were the portraits, for one. Not in the basement, not yet, but scattered across the upstairs hallway. Oil paintings of men and women, each rendered with stern expressions, their eyes too lifelike, too direct. Their frames were gilded once, though time had dulled the shine. These portraits seemed less decorative than accusatory, as if the walls themselves disapproved of intrusion. Beyond the physical decay, there was the history. And the history was complicated. The family that had built the house had been prominent in the region, their name tied to land ownership and trade. They survived the upheavals of war and reconstruction, weaving themselves into the fabric of the town's economy. Yet, for all their presence in public life, their private records told another story: gaps, inconsistencies, and vanishing names. It was as though whole branches of the family tree had been pruned away, deliberately forgotten. Neighbors noticed patterns, though they rarely spoke of them aloud. Each generation seemed marked by tragedy. A child would vanish without explanation. A husband would die suddenly, leaving no body for burial. A woman's face would appear in town one spring, then be gone the next, never spoken of again. When pressed, family members responded with polite silence, smiles too rigid to invite further questions. Over time, the house itself absorbed those silences, becoming synonymous with mystery. Inside, objects have been left in place as though their owners expected to return. A half-broken clock sat on the mantel, its hands forever paused at 5 minutes past 3. A row of books remained on a shelf, their spines stiff with dust, their pages fused by moisture. A child's rocking horse leaned against the wall of an upstairs bedroom, its paint flaking, its wooden eyes blank. These were not artifacts of a home abandoned in haste, but of a home abandoned with deliberation, as if what was left behind carried meaning too unsettling to carry away. In the kitchen, beneath the peeling paint and warped cupboards, there lingered faint carvings in the wood. Initials, dates, and strange symbols. Some resembled common doodles or shorthand, others defied interpretation entirely, resembling runes or marks with no clear origin. Who had carved them, and why, remained a question that offered no answers. The town's records confirmed only fragments. Census entries listed family members who appeared once, then never again. Birth registries carried names that matched gravestones, but not lifespans. In some years, the house was filled with occupants, in others, it stood strangely empty, as though the family had collectively retreated into shadow. This uncertainty fed into folklore. Local children dared each other to run past the house after sunset, claiming to see faces in its windows even when it was unoccupied. Adults, more discreet, admitted a sense of unease when walking too close. Some swore they heard footsteps echoing inside, though the house was locked tight. Others spoke of lamps glowing faintly in rooms where no one lived. None of these claims could be proven, but all contributed to the house's reputation. It was not merely abandoned, it was unsettled. What most disturbed visitors, however, was the feeling of repetition. Enter one room, and the arrangement of furniture seemed mirrored in another. Stare long enough at a hallway portrait, and one realized it bore an uncanny resemblance to another portrait in a different frame, painted decades apart. The resemblance extended beyond coincidence. It was as if the house was filled with echoes of the same figures, repeating endlessly in different guises. For the protagonist, discovering the basement was only possible after first walking through this haunted architecture of memory. Each step carried the sensation of intrusion, of trespassing not upon an empty house but upon something still alive with presence. The silence was not absence, it was watchfulness. And so, when he finally reached the concealed door at the end of a narrow corridor, when he brushed aside the dust and pried open its protesting hinges, he was not merely descending into a basement. He was stepping deeper into the house's memory. The photographs waiting below did not appear out of nowhere. They were a continuation of the story the house had been trying to tell all along. This was not a house forgotten by time. It was a house preserving time. Holding it captive in wood, in portraits, in silence. And now, in photographs that stared back with identical faces. The house was not simply the stage for a mystery. It was the mystery. A structure built not only of stone and wood but of repetition, silence, and secrets. Its walls contained generations of faces, stories, and disappearances. And in its basement, those stories finally revealed themselves, not as legends, not as rumors, but as something tangible, staring outward from behind glass frames, demanding to be seen. A family's history is never written in stone. It is shaped by memory, by the stories told at tables and whispered in corridors, and by the records left behind in fragile ink. Yet, in this family, the history felt less like a tree branching outward and more like a circle folding back upon itself. The deeper one looked, the less it seemed to grow. It only repeated. The first records appeared normal enough. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, the everyday paper trail that turns lives into evidence. But when the protagonist examined them carefully, odd patterns emerged. Names reappeared across centuries, not as honorifics passed down, but as full identities resurfacing. An Elias in 1847. Another Elias, born in 1892. Then a third, recorded again in 1938. Each man, according to documents and fading photographs, bore the same face. The resemblance was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Some records dissolved into absence altogether. Census entries listed family members who never appeared again, as if they had walked off the page and into nothing. Marriage records bore names of spouses who were never mentioned in later years. Birth registers carried infants' names with no accompanying death notices, no graves, no markers. It was not merely a history of presence, but of vanishing. Among the belongings left in the house were journals and letters. Some were mundane, notes on weather, harvests, debts owed. Yet scattered among them were stranger passages, half-formed confessions that spoke of repetition and dread. One letter, dated 1874, warned of the return of faces, too familiar to be strangers. Another journal described dreams in which the writer sat at a dinner table surrounded by identical guests, all wearing his own face, all silent, all watching. The protagonist read these fragments with unease, recognizing the consistency of fear across generations. Different hands, different decades, yet the same theme, the terror of self-duplication. Each writer seemed convinced they were living a cycle that would outlast them, that their likeness was destined to reappear in someone yet unborn. The town, too, carried memories of these repetitions. Old men remembered seeing a boy in the schoolyard who looked exactly like a boy from their own childhood. Women recalled weddings where the groom was the very image of a man they had danced with 30 years earlier. These were dismissed as strong family traits, the kind of resemblance that runs in blood. But whispered too quietly to ignore was the sense that these were not traits. They were returns. Even within the family, recognition became unbearable. Cousins avoided one another, unsettled by the fact that each face reflected another. Portraits were hidden, sometimes destroyed, not because of shame but because of dread. It was said that one ancestor, upon noticing his uncanny likeness in a photograph of a distant relative, burned every image of himself he could find. He died insisting that no trace of his face should remain, for fear it would be used to summon him again. The repetition extended beyond names and faces. Diaries spoke of the same illnesses, striking generations apart. The same accidents occurred on the same dates, in the same fields. Even phrases repeated themselves. One ancestor described the burden of recognition, and 50 years later, another used the exact same words, unaware they had already been written. It was as though the family's story was not unfolding but echoing, with each life a faint reverberation of another. In the churchyard where the family's dead were buried, this pattern revealed itself most starkly. Gravestones bore names that repeated every 30 or 40 years. The carving on each was weathered, but the dates never overlapped. Elias. Margaret. Thomas. Again and again. The effect was unsettling, a graveyard where one might believe the same handful of people had been buried multiple times, their lives stretched like shadows across centuries. Folklore grew from these repetitions. Children were warned not to linger near mirrors, lest they see not their own reflection but the face of a relative long dead. Some claimed that family members avoided sleep during storms, fearing dreams that pulled them backward into earlier lives. Others whispered of gatherings where two identical relatives met, neither willing to speak, both convinced the other was a phantom. For the protagonist, tracing this history was like walking a labyrinth. Each turn led back to where he began. Each document, each story, circled to the same conclusion: this was a family not defined by lineage but by recurrence. The more he searched for individuality, the more it dissolved into likeness. The most haunting evidence lay in the faded family Bible, found tucked in a drawer in the house. Its pages recorded births and deaths with meticulous care. Yet alongside the names were strange annotations, notations like, again, returned, and not the first. One entry for a child born in 1911 was followed by the phrase, second time with us. Another, beneath a death in 1925, read simply, he will be back. It was not the language of genealogy. It was the language of inevitability. The echoes in the family line were not only in documents, not only in portraits. They were in the very way the family understood itself, as a cycle, not a progression. To be born into it was to inherit more than blood. It was to inherit a face that had lived before and, perhaps, would live again. As the protagonist pieced these fragments together, the weight of inheritance grew unbearable. He looked in mirrors differently now, not to see himself, but to search for others looking back. He understood the basement photographs not as an isolated curiosity, but as the inevitable archive of a family that could not escape its own repetition. And in that understanding came the dreadful realization: his likeness was not unique, not personal. It was a continuation. An echo waiting to be carried forward. Every community has its stories. Some are celebrated, spoken of with pride. Others are whispered, exchanged quietly in kitchens or on porches when the night is deep enough to protect the teller. In the small town that bordered the family's estate, the whispers had persisted for generations. They were not written in newspapers or church bulletins. They were passed mouth to mouth, never loudly, always cautiously, as though to speak them too plainly might summon the thing being spoken of. It began, as all folklore does, with observations. A farmhand, decades earlier, insisted he had seen the same man working the fields in both his youth and his old age, unchanged, bunaged, his face identical, his movements familiar. A schoolteacher in 1890 dismissed a mischievous boy from her class, only for her granddaughter to report the very same boy, bearing the same name, expelled for the same mischief in 1955. These stories were laughed at on the surface, but beneath the laughter was discomfort. Coincidence was one thing. Exact repetition was another. The town barber spoke of cutting the hair of a man in 1920 who bore the same scar, in the same place, as another customer from 1875. A woman attending a church service in 1932 claimed that as the preacher spoke, she saw, sitting across the aisle, the image of her own mother, unchanged since her youth, though her mother had been dead for decades. Such accounts rarely made it beyond the threshold of private conversation, but they left marks on the listeners. The uncanny did not reveal itself in bold spectacles. It appeared in quiet moments, small details too precise to be dismissed. Faces reappeared in wedding photographs separated by half a century. Names surfaced on rosters of community events, matched with signatures indistinguishable from earlier generations. Even handwriting, with its unique flourishes and idiosyncrasies, seemed to echo across decades, as though the same hand had been moving again and again. The whispers extended beyond the family itself. Townspeople spoke of encountering strangers whose features unsettled them, not because they were foreign, but because they were too familiar. Some avoided the family entirely, claiming that to look too long into their faces was to lose a sense of one's own individuality. Others treated them with a mixture of reverence and fear, as though they carried within them something not quite human, not quite explainable. At community gatherings, such as harvest festivals or town meetings, there was always a moment when someone would fall silent, staring too long at a particular family member. The silence would ripple outward until others noticed the resemblance, to an ancestor they remembered, to a figure captured in old sketches or daguerreotypes. The atmosphere grew thick, conversations faltered, and eyes slid away quickly. In those moments, the family became an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting something the town did not wish to confront. Whispers became superstition. Children dared one another to run past the family's house at night, claiming to see faces at the windows that matched their own. Some insisted the family never truly died, only repeated. Adults, more cautious, spoke of the family line as, the ones who came back. The phrase was vague enough to pass as harmless, but everyone who used it knew its darker implication. The uncanny also appeared in church records. Ministers noted baptizing infants whose names already appeared in earlier registers. Confirmation ceremonies included youths whose resemblance to earlier congregants was impossible to ignore. Though the church discouraged talk of superstition, even the clergy could not entirely ignore the pattern. Some quietly avoided assigning the family to public scripture readings, fearing their voices would sound too familiar, two repeated. The whispers grew louder when outsiders noticed. Travelers passing through the town sometimes remarked upon the strange likeness of one resident to another they had seen years before. A photographer, visiting in the 1920s, developed an image of a young man and swore he had already taken the same photograph decades earlier, in a different state. These observations gave the whispers weight, validation from beyond the insular memory of the town. Over time, the stories took on the shape of warnings. It was said that if you stared too long into the eyes of a family member, you might see not just them, but all who came before. Some claimed that mirrors in the family's home did not reflect true likenesses, but rather previous iterations of the self, flickering faintly in the glass. A few told of voices heard in empty rooms, not ghosts, but echoes, as if conversations from decades past replayed themselves without context. For the protagonist, listening to these whispers was like assembling a fractured mosaic. Each piece was incomplete on its own, easily dismissed. But together they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. The repetition was everywhere, in the fields, the schools, the churches, the very fabric of town life. It was not limited to the basement photographs. It was embedded in the collective memory of the community. The psychological weight of these whispers could not be measured. Imagine living in a town where time did not feel linear, where one could never be sure whether the man across the street was truly a neighbor or a return of someone long gone. Imagine realizing that every wedding, every funeral, every ordinary gathering might include faces that did not belong to the present at all, but to some earlier chapter. That was the reality whispered in this town, though never admitted aloud. Even skeptics could not completely dismiss the unease. A historian might call it exaggeration, the natural tendency to see patterns where none existed. A scientist might attribute it to genetics, the strong recurrence of features across bloodlines. But these explanations felt too thin, too clinical, when held against the lived experiences of generations who had seen, with their own eyes, the uncanny repetition of faces and names. Whispers, of course, are not proof. They do not satisfy the demand for evidence. But they persist for a reason. They persist because they carry a truth that is felt, if not proven. In this town, the truth was simple and chilling: some people did not seem to belong to only one era. They belonged to many. And though the townspeople laughed in daylight, though they spoke with caution in public, when the night deepened and silence pressed heavy, the whispers rose again. Always the same story. Always the same question. How could anyone explain a family that seemed to return, again and again, with faces that defied time itself? In communities bound tightly by tradition, mystery rarely survives untouched. It is filtered, interpreted, and reshaped through faith. For centuries, the small town surrounding the house had been governed not only by its civic institutions but by its church, the steeple standing high above rooftops as both a beacon and a warning. And when the whispers of uncanny repetition reached the pulpit, they did not remain whispers for long. The church declared early on that the stories of likeness and return were temptations. The idea that a family could somehow defy the natural order of aging, dying, and resting was not treated as wonder but as heresy. Ministers thundered from the pulpit that such claims were the work of deception, tools of the adversary meant to lead souls astray. They warned that to speak openly of repeating faces was to invite blasphemy, to open the door to the devil's influence. Families within the congregation learned quickly that silence was safer than speculation. Children were hushed when they remarked on uncanny resemblances between cousins and portraits. Adults lowered their voices when discussing missing records or familiar handwriting. The community began to practice an unspoken rule: what was noticed was not to be named. To name it would be to defy God's order and risk damnation. But suppression never erased the fear. It only displaced it. Behind closed doors, families prayed with greater intensity, asking for protection from whatever curse seemed to linger. Mothers pinned crosses above children's beds. Fathers sprinkled salt across thresholds at night. And though the ministers denied the reality of repetition, they quietly permitted rituals that bordered on superstition, provided they were framed as prayers. Faith became both shield and cage, offering comfort while insisting upon silence. The family at the center of the mystery bore the greatest weight. Though devout, they carried the mark of suspicion. Congregants avoided sitting too close to them during services. Communion, for them, was received with eyes upon them, eyes searching for proof of holiness, or for some sign of corruption. It was whispered that even their hymns sounded different, the same voices echoing across decades, recognizable to older ears who had heard them before. In private, the family wrestled with their place within the church. Diaries suggested that some members clung fiercely to faith, believing the likenesses to be tests sent by God. They prayed not for answers but for endurance, hoping their obedience would shield them from judgment. Others confessed doubt, writing that perhaps they were indeed cursed, their bloodline marked by sin no sermon could absolve. Some considered leaving the church altogether, yet fear of isolation, both social and spiritual, kept them tethered. The minister's suppression grew more forceful as the stories persisted. One preacher in the early 20th century condemned a parishioner publicly for speaking too openly about the boy who returned. That parishioner was denied communion for 6 months, a punishment severe enough to silence others. Another minister insisted that photographs of the family should never be displayed within the church, arguing that images were already too easily manipulated by the enemy. Yet the suppression had unintended effects. The more the church denied the stories, the more they grew in the shadows. The whispers took on the power of forbidden knowledge, passed with greater secrecy, layered with fear. When people cannot speak of something openly, they speak of it more intensely in private. The result was not silence but a doubling of superstition, an underground current of belief that carried more weight than official sermons. The conflict between faith and fear also produced rituals of quiet desperation. Some family members were baptized multiple times, hoping to wash away whatever mark bound them to repetition. Others submitted to exorcisms, though none were recorded as successful. A few went further still, consulting folk healers who prescribed charms, powders, or whispered incantations meant to cut the cycle. These practices never lasted long, for once discovered, they brought condemnation. But their existence testified to the depth of unease, and the inadequacy of official explanations. The tension seeped into the town's broader culture. Teachers discouraged children from studying too closely the history of local families. Neighbors avoided speaking aloud of deaths or funerals that felt too familiar. When new photographs were taken, some refused to look at them, fearing they might glimpse a face they had already seen. In this way, faith did not extinguish the uncanny. It cloaked it in silence, turning every resemblance into a private crisis of belief. For outsiders, the town's silence was striking. Researchers or genealogists who inquired into the family often met polite resistance. Records were withheld, excuses offered. A library ledger from the 1940s notes that certain books on genealogy were checked out repeatedly but never returned, as though the town itself was determined to erase traces that might draw attention. What faith could not suppress directly, the community buried under layers of omission. Still, within the family, the pressure of suppression was unbearable. Some members broke under it, confessing in their journals that they felt trapped between God and inheritance. One wrote, "I dare not speak, but I see them every day. My brother's face in the mirror, though he has been gone 20 years. I pray, yet prayer only deepens the silence." Another described attending service and recognizing, among the congregation, not strangers but faces he had already seen in faded photographs. He left convinced that worship itself was filled with repetitions. By the mid-20th century, suppression had become tradition. Generations were raised not only to endure resemblance but to ignore it. Parents instructed children to treat familiarity as coincidence, no matter how impossible it seemed. Ministers no longer thundered as loudly from the pulpit, but the weight of inherited silence was even heavier. What could not be spoken of was carried inward, becoming private burdens that eroded certainty, eroded faith itself. The irony was inescapable. The church had sought to protect its flock from fear, yet in silencing the uncanny, it ensured the fear became permanent. It transformed repetition into taboo, into something never confronted, only endured. Faith did not banish the mystery. It made the mystery sacred, untouchable, unexplainable, and thus more powerful. For the protagonist, uncovering this layer of history illuminated the depth of denial. The photographs in the basement were not anomalies left in secret, they were the very evidence generations had worked desperately to bury. The church had not erased the mystery. It had enshrined it in silence. And in that silence, the family line carried forward, returning, repeating, bearing the burden of recognition, unspoken yet inescapable. Recognition is supposed to be a comfort. We look into a face and see kinship, see the reassurance of shared features, familiar gestures. But within this family, recognition became its own torment. What should have been warmth instead became dread, for to recognize was to confront the impossible, to look upon someone alive and see, not a child or a cousin, but the unmistakable return of a face already consigned to memory. The photographs in the basement offered the clearest proof. Their rows were neat, precise, showing generation after generation. Yet to anyone who looked closely, the effect was disturbing. Every third or fourth image was not new but repeated, as though time had folded upon itself. An uncle's stern gaze reappeared decades later in the portrait of a nephew. A woman's delicate expression, captured in sepia tones, was seen again almost unchanged in a granddaughter, her posture identical, her eyes haunted by the same melancholy. The effect was not of inheritance but of duplication, the old reborn in the new without even the courtesy of variation. Those who lived with these faces carried an unbearable burden. Imagine the subtle shock of sitting at the dinner table and recognizing, in the shape of a smile, the return of a sibling buried long ago. Imagine watching a child grow, not into themselves but into someone already remembered, as if the future had been stolen and replaced with repetition. Parents spoke of joy dulled by suspicion. Grandparents confessed to confusion, unable to mourn fully when grief was never allowed to stay buried. The town's silence amplified this torment. Unable to speak of what they saw, family members carried recognition as a private ache. Journals and letters revealed attempts to rationalize, perhaps memory played tricks, or photographs exaggerated resemblance. But the insistence of the likenesses wore away denial. The more they tried to dismiss it, the more powerful recognition became. It was not merely the eyes, or the tilt of the jaw, it was the entire presence, the intangible familiarity that no rational excuse could weaken. Recognition also fractured relationships. Some members of the family resisted it fiercely, insisting that resemblance was nothing more than bloodline. They grew angry when others suggested otherwise, as if speaking it aloud gave it more power. Others could not resist naming what they saw, even if only in secret notes. This divide created quiet battles within the household, one side defending normalcy, the other drawn into obsession. Both were exhausted, yet neither could escape the grip of recognition. Psychologically, the burden was corrosive. For the children who resembled those long dead, the knowledge was suffocating. They grew up surrounded by whispers, their lives measured not by who they were becoming but by who they already were. Some recoiled from photographs, refusing to be captured, fearing that each image was less their own than the shadow of another. One diary records a child tearing pages from family albums, sobbing that, "I don't want his face. I want mine." And for the elders, recognition was a different weight. They had seen it before, across decades, and could trace the pattern. They became reluctant to love too deeply, for affection risked transforming into despair when the loved one's face returned after burial. To outlive a generation only to see it resurrected within the next was not blessing but curse, a reminder that grief never closed its door. Recognition also brought suspicion from outsiders. Those who visited the town occasionally remarked on it, an uncanny feeling that everyone seemed familiar, that time itself appeared stagnant. Such remarks were never welcomed, but they reinforced what the family already knew, it was not only their burden but something perceivable by strangers as well. Recognition was too powerful to hide completely, even when words were forbidden. Some sought escape from the cycle by leaving. Yet even in distant cities, recognition followed them. Letters describe encounters where distant cousins were mistaken for ancestors by people who had never known the family. The likeness was so strong that strangers believed themselves haunted, unsettled by what they thought was resemblance but what the family understood as repetition. Distance did not sever the burden. It carried across states, across oceans, as though the face itself was inescapable. The emotional toll led to fractures within identity. Children who resembled the dead sometimes adopted entirely new behaviors, desperate to prove difference. They dressed in styles no one else in the family wore, spoke with exaggerated mannerisms, or embraced careers utterly foreign to the household tradition. Yet these efforts felt futile. The face remained, immutable, and no performance could conceal the recognition it inspired. They remained shadows of someone else, even as they fought to step into light. The burden was not only personal but generational. Parents struggled with the guilt of bringing children into the world when they knew those children might be born into repetition. Some records speak of reluctance to marry, hesitation to continue the line. Others reveal prayers begging for children to be spared the likeness, though such prayers were rarely answered. Birth, which should have been celebration, became anticipation of dread, whose face would return this time. Over time, recognition hardened into fatalism. Some ceased resisting, instead resigning themselves to the cycle. They began referring to the returning faces not as coincidences but as inevitabilities, part of their bloodline's strange inheritance. This fatalism drained vitality from life. If the future was only repetition, then joy was dulled, individuality erased. Recognition stripped them of hope, leaving only endurance. And yet, within this burden lay a paradox. To deny recognition was impossible, yet to embrace it was unbearable. It was a weight without resolution, a haunting without release. Each photograph in the basement was not only evidence of repetition but also a silent accusation: the living could never escape the faces of the dead. For the protagonist, uncovering these testimonies was devastating. The photographs had already unsettled him, but learning of the lived burden gave them deeper horror. These were not curiosities. They were wounds carried across generations, wounds that recognition reopened again and again. The family did not simply resemble their ancestors. They were bound to them, shackled by repetition, trapped in the gaze of the familiar. Recognition had become their inheritance. And like any inheritance, it demanded to be carried, whether they wished it or not. When a mystery persists for too long, people demand explanations. Silence itself becomes intolerable. And so, in the wake of unease and generational repetition, the family and their neighbors reached for answers. Yet the explanations, though numerous, never satisfied. Each theory offered the promise of clarity, but every attempt at reason left behind only deeper shadows. The earliest explanations were the most practical, born of necessity. Some spoke of strong genetics. Families, after all, often shared striking features. To an outsider, resemblance could be uncanny, but to scientists and physicians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, inheritance was a simple truth. Perhaps, they argued, this family carried unusually dominant traits, manifesting in repetition so strong that likenesses appeared uncanny. Yet even the most rigid believer in biology could not ignore the photographs. Likeness did not merely echo across siblings. It jumped decades, returning not with softened differences but with precision. No theory of inheritance could account for the return of the exact same jawline, the precise downturn of lips, the unmistakable eyes that mirrored those buried long ago. Other explanations leaned into memory's frailty. Perhaps grief exaggerated perception. Families long for the departed, and so they imagine them in the faces of the young. A smile triggers remembrance, a fleeting resemblance grows into conviction. In this telling, repetition was not real, but the trickery of minds unable to release their dead. And yet, photographs do not dream. They do not ache with longing. They are impartial witnesses. And when two photographs, taken 50 years apart, show faces that appear identical, no plea to memory can erase the evidence. Religious interpretations soon emerged. In small towns and isolated parishes, repetition of faces was read as punishment or omen. One priest declared it a sign of unbroken sin, the faces returning as a reminder that repentance had never been sufficient. Another whispered that it was a form of purgatory, the souls of the family trapped, unable to move forward, forced to live again in endless imitation until redemption was found. Parishioners, though uneasy, nodded to such words, for faith offered language where science faltered. But whispers persisted that these theories were meant less for truth than for control, a way to preserve silence by cloaking fear in ritual. Folklore, however, spoke more freely. The townspeople, though careful not to write their thoughts, shared them in hushed conversations. Some claimed the land itself was cursed, binding those born upon it to endless cycles. Others spoke of a pact, an unremembered bargain struck generations earlier that chained descendants to the likeness of their ancestors. There were even tales of mirrors buried beneath foundations, reflecting faces upward through bloodlines, imprinting children before they drew their first breath. Such stories were fanciful, yet in their strangeness, they captured what the family felt, that repetition was not natural, but imposed. As decades passed, more scholarly attempts arose. Anthropologists examined the photographs, remarking on their uniformity, suggesting inbreeding, isolation, or even the narrowing effect of limited gene pools in small towns. These assessments carried a certain authority, yet they too fell short. Inbred communities produce variations of similarity, but not carbon copies. They do not recreate the same face with eerie precision, nor do they reanimate expression, posture, and presence across eras. The explanation of isolation might comfort academics, but for those who lived with the photographs, it was not nearly enough. By the mid-20th century, psychology offered its lens. Carl Jung's notion of archetypes was quietly invoked. Perhaps these faces were not repetitions at all, but manifestations of shared archetypal images carried deep within the collective unconscious. In this framework, the family embodied certain eternal forms, their visages echoing not from blood but from symbols. Such theories fascinated intellectuals but meant little to grieving parents who looked upon a newborn child and saw their dead brother staring back at them. For the afflicted, symbolism was no balm. Then came superstition cloaked in scientific language. A few theorists speculated on time itself, that the town, or the family, had slipped into a loop, that history was not unfolding forward but spiraling, replaying faces as it replayed moments. Some even dared suggest reincarnation, that souls, unwilling or unable to move onward, found their way back into the family line, not wandering across the world as doctrine promised but tethered to a single bloodline. In this view, repetition was not accident but destiny, the same soul wearing the same mask again and again. Yet such theories, whether scientific, religious, or folkloric, shared one thing in common: none brought relief. They might intrigue, but they could not lift the burden of recognition. At best, they offered words to frame the mystery. At worst, they deepened dread, suggesting that what the family experienced was not accident but sentence. The protagonist, standing amidst this tangle of explanations, found no comfort. He read accounts of neighbors dismissing the repetition as imagination, only to fall silent when shown the photographs. He studied notes from priests who condemned the family as cursed yet offered no redemption. He considered the anthropologist's sterile reports, devoid of empathy, describing his kin as though they were specimens. None of it brought resolution. Perhaps the most chilling explanation came not from scholars or priests but from within the family itself. In a set of handwritten pages, hidden beneath boards in the basement, an ancestor confessed to a belief unspoken elsewhere, that the faces were not repetitions of blood or soul, but intrusions. That something outside the family, beyond human comprehension, had chosen to wear their likenesses as one wears a mask. The writer begged forgiveness for even recording the thought, fearing that naming it aloud might make it real. Yet the words lingered, unsettling. If true, then the family was not cursed by inheritance or bound by sin, but haunted by an external force that found their features convenient vessels. In the end, explanations became as numerous as the photographs themselves. Each face in the basement could be paired with a theory, each theory with a hope of closure. Yet none erased the unease, none stilled the chill that ran through those who looked upon the images. Theories multiplied, but truth remained hidden, cloaked behind repetition. And so the family lived in tension, between the rational and the irrational, the possible and the impossible. Science could not explain the identical faces. Religion could not soothe the repetition. Folklore could not lift the curse. Recognition remained, unsolved, undeniable. Theories and explanations may provide words, but words do not always heal. In this family, they became only another layer of burden, a mask worn atop the endless faces. The photographs remained, silent and accusing, impervious to interpretation. The more the photographs multiplied, the more the family withdrew. At first, the basement was merely a place of storage, a chamber where past and present brushed against each other in dust and silence. But as years passed, it became a burden, a weight pressing down on the house itself. To live above it was to live with an awareness that the dead were never truly gone, that they stared upward through layers of timber and stone, demanding recognition. The family began to carry this knowledge not as memory but as constant presence. It became part of the air they breathed, part of the stillness of every night. Neighbors noticed the change. Once the household had been known, if not for warmth, then at least for participation. They attended church, helped with harvests, and joined in the steady rhythm of rural life. But gradually, their appearances dwindled. Invitations to gatherings were declined. Children who once played freely in yards were kept close to home. The family moved less through the town and more within the confines of their property, as though the world beyond could no longer be trusted. Whispers arose that they had secrets. Some suggested wealth hidden away, others spoke of illness. Few imagined the truth, that photographs, those ordinary objects of memory, had become instruments of dread. Isolation fed upon itself. The fewer people they saw, the less they wished to see. Outsiders asked questions, too many, too directly. A visitor might notice a child's face, then recall an old photograph, then remark aloud about similarity. Even innocent comments became unbearable. It was easier, safer, to avoid the risk altogether. And so, gradually, the family became a household apart, shrouded in self-imposed exile. Inside the home, silence deepened. Rooms once filled with chatter became places of muted observation. Family meals were quiet affairs, each glance at a child tinged with suspicion. Whose face did they carry? Which ancestor returned in their features? Birthdays, once celebrations, grew heavy with tension, for each new life carried the threat of another repetition. Laughter was stifled, replaced with the uneasy awareness that joy itself might invite recognition. The spiral into isolation did not occur all at once. It was slow, measured, as though time itself conspired to draw the walls tighter. A daughter declined invitations to courtship, preferring solitude to the risk of bringing outsiders into the family's secret. A son abandoned prospects of work in nearby towns, unwilling to endure questions about his resemblance to those long buried. Marriage prospects shrank, limited to those few who either did not notice or chose not to question. And so, generation by generation, the family folded inward, binding itself to the house, to the land, and most of all, to the photographs. With isolation came suspicion. When illness struck, whispers suggested punishment. When crops failed, neighbors muttered of curses. The family's withdrawal fed these rumors, and rumors, in turn, drove them deeper into seclusion. The world beyond their property became not only foreign but hostile. Each step outside the gates risked exposure, ridicule, or worse, discovery. It was easier to remain within, to cultivate their own silence. Inside the basement, the photographs grew in number. Each new likeness was added carefully, almost ritualistically, as though the act itself acknowledged the inevitability of repetition. To refuse would have been denial, yet to continue was agony. Descendants carried the burden of tending to these archives, placing images alongside their ghostly twins, aligning them in neat rows that only deepened the terror. Over time, the photographs ceased to be family records. They became monuments to a curse unbroken, evidence of a cycle no one could escape. The isolation carried psychological costs. Children raised in silence grew into adults who mistrusted others. They carried the weight of secrets not of their own making. For some, the knowledge became too much, and they abandoned the household entirely, disappearing into distant cities. Yet even they could not outrun resemblance. Faces, after all, could be recognized anywhere. For those who remained, life became a strange theater, each day a performance of normalcy, each glance haunted by suspicion. It was not uncommon for arguments to erupt within the house. Fathers accused mothers of noticing resemblances too quickly. Siblings accused one another of exaggeration, of inventing likeness where none existed. The basement, once merely storage, became a battlefield of memory and denial. Some demanded the photographs be destroyed, that the evidence be burned, allowing the family to breathe again. Yet others refused, insisting that destruction would not end the cycle, only blind them to its proof. In this way, the photographs became both prison and chain, the reason for their suffering and the only record of its truth. As the decades turned, their isolation became tradition. Children grew up without playmates beyond the house. Their education was limited to what parents could provide, for schools brought too many eyes, too many comparisons. Outsiders began to speak of them as the family that kept to itself, and over time, even curiosity waned. What had once been whispered about as strangeness became accepted as simply the way things were. They had folded themselves into silence so deeply that the world stopped asking why. Yet within the house, the spiral continued. Each new photograph, each new repetition, drew the walls tighter. Privacy became secrecy. Secrecy became suffocation. And in that suffocation, the line between vigilance and paranoia blurred. Some claimed to see movement in the photographs, as though the faces themselves watched from the walls. Others swore that the basement air carried voices, faint echoes of those whose likenesses returned. Whether delusion or truth, the effect was the same: the family retreated further, folding inward until nothing remained but themselves, their photographs, and the silence between. Isolation, once chosen for safety, became their defining condition. It shaped them as surely as bloodline or inheritance. By the mid-20th century, few in town could even recall the sound of their laughter. They were remembered not for deeds or kindness, but for absence. An empty pew at church, an empty seat at gatherings, a silent house behind shuttered windows. And in that silence, the cycle endured. Faces returned, photographs multiplied, and the family, bound to their own history, spiraled deeper into seclusion. The world beyond moved forward, wars were fought, industries rose, towns grew and changed. But within the house, time thickened, repeating itself endlessly in the gaze of identical eyes. When a family withdraws so deeply into itself, the community around it cannot help but respond. In the town, the house became a landmark not for its grandeur but for its silence. Neighbors passed it without waving. Children, urged by curiosity and fear in equal measure, dared one another to run across its yard but seldom lingered. To most, it was a house occupied by shadows. No music drifted from its windows, no conversations spilled across its porch. Only the muted creak of shutters or the rare glimpse of a figure at a window reminded anyone that life persisted within. The silence bred its own explanations. Some believed the family had lost its fortune, ashamed to reveal their decline. Others whispered of illness, of deformities, of madness. The truth, however, remained hidden, sealed behind basement doors and pressed into the stiff paper of countless photographs. It was easier for townspeople to imagine poverty or disgrace than to confront the strangeness of likeness itself. And so, speculation became habit. Each theory layered upon the next until no one could say with certainty which, if any, held truth. The aftermath of such secrecy extended beyond rumor. Over time, the town began to accommodate the family's absence. Invitations ceased. Requests for participation in civic duties went unspoken. What had begun as confusion hardened into acceptance. They were simply not part of the town anymore. In their absence, myths flourished. The children of the next generation grew up hearing tales of the family whose faces repeated through time. By then, the line between fact and story blurred. A child might insist that an old photograph in the school archives matched the boy seen at church last week. A girl might claim that her grandmother remembered the same face decades earlier. With each telling, the legend became more secure, more inevitable. Silence also carried a practical effect. Records went unexamined. Histories were allowed to fade. The family itself, preferring to remain invisible, did little to preserve its public story. Births and deaths were noted only in the most formal ways, stripped of detail. Weddings were small, quiet affairs, if they happened at all. Obituaries offered no photographs, no tributes, only names. Thus, the community lost the threads that might have explained continuity. The family lived within its walls, and outside those walls, only absence remained. For the town, this absence eventually became part of its character. Visitors would ask about the large house on the edge of the woods, and locals would shrug, offering vague accounts. Some suggested the family preferred privacy, others, with a knowing glance, spoke of curses and repetition. But few pressed further. Curiosity, in matters like this, was dangerous. Better to accept mystery than to pry too deeply. And so the family's silence was protected not only by their own retreat but by the community's reluctance to disturb it. The aftermath left its mark on generations. For those who lived nearby, the house represented something fixed, immovable, a reminder that not all stories followed the simple arc of progress. Some lines did not stretch forward but folded in on themselves. The family became both invisible and unforgettable. They seldom appeared in daily life, but their legend haunted conversation, shaping the town's collective imagination. In a sense, they became characters rather than neighbors, figures in a cautionary tale told to children who dared approach the property's edge. Yet silence is never complete. Now and then, someone from the family ventured into town. These appearances, though rare, were never ordinary. The sight of one of them at the general store or post office sparked quiet murmurs. People compared the visitor's face not only to relatives but to photographs long recalled. "Doesn't he look like the one from," someone might begin, before cutting themselves short, unwilling to say aloud what everyone thought. Such encounters reinforced the legend, providing glimpses without explanation, confirmations without context. Over the decades, the family's name slipped from prominence. Once it had carried weight, tied to land and labor, to contribution and participation. Now it was spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. The community did not hate them, rather, it absorbed their absence, adjusting as though they had already stepped out of time. The town grew, shifted, modernized, but the house remained still, fixed in its silence, refusing to yield its mystery. The psychological aftermath extended beyond the family. For those in town, the legend carried weight. Children grew up with the idea that time could repeat itself, that faces could return unchanged. This notion seeped into dreams and fears. Some avoided mirrors at night, afraid of seeing not themselves but another. Others traced family trees anxiously, searching for likenesses, as though resemblance itself might signal entrapment. The story became less about one household and more about the possibility that history might never fully let go. Silence also shaped memory. When older townsfolk tried to recall specific events involving the family, details blurred. Dates slipped, names confused. What remained clear was only the strangeness of their existence. Absence, paradoxically, became presence. Their silence echoed louder than words. And in that echo, the community found both fascination and unease. For while most families left legacies of achievement or ruin, this family left a legacy of repetition, a cycle seen in photographs, whispered in stories, and never resolved. By the late 20th century, the house stood as both relic and warning. Its windows clouded, its paint weathered, its gardens overgrown. Yet still it remained inhabited, though few could say by how many. Children of new generations still ran past its gates, daring one another to look inside. Adults, though they claimed indifference, avoided lingering near its shadow. The aftermath of silence had become permanence. The family had withdrawn so thoroughly that they no longer needed secrecy, their absence had become their shield. And in that quiet shield, the cycle continued, unbroken. Faces returned. Photographs multiplied. And the town, unwilling to disturb the silence, allowed the story to remain unfinished, carried forward in whispers, in rumors, in the uneasy knowledge that some mysteries are not solved but simply endured. Every mystery demands resolution, but not every story grants one. For those who studied the house, the photographs, and the family that lived in near perpetual silence, theories accumulated like dust in the corners of an abandoned room. Each theory attempted to explain the impossible, how faces could return generation after generation, unaltered, as though time had no authority over them. The most rational observers leaned on genetics. They argued that resemblance can run powerfully through families, carried by dominant traits. Perhaps what seemed uncanny was simply inheritance at its most dramatic. Yet even within this explanation, unease lingered. In ordinary cases, features repeat in fragments, a grandfather's jaw, a mother's eyes, a child's smile. But in this family, resemblance was total. Whole faces mirrored one another across centuries. It was not fragments passed down but entire identities reproduced. To call it coincidence seemed inadequate. To call it science seemed forced. Others suggested psychological distortion. The community, after years of silence and absence, might have exaggerated resemblance into exactness. Memories can be unreliable, shaped by expectation. Perhaps the town needed a story to fill the family's absence, and so it created one, magnifying ordinary likeness into uncanny duplication. Yet the photographs complicated this theory. They remained physical, undeniable artifacts. In them, eyes did not merely resemble, they matched. Faces did not echo, they repeated. For every skeptical dismissal, the photographs demanded reconsideration. Folklore, naturally, offered its own possibilities. Some spoke of curses, bargains made long ago, binding descendants to endless repetition. A whispered tale told of a woman who had once defied the family, only to see her own children suffer untimely deaths. Others hinted at an ancient pact, that by surrendering individuality, the family preserved itself against misfortune. Such theories framed likeness not as chance but as consequence, a price paid for survival. Yet curses and pacts, though compelling, lacked evidence. They explained without clarifying, offering comfort in the form of myth. More esoteric theories drew from the metaphysical. Some believed the family's home sat upon a place where time folded. Just as rivers curve and mountains rise, perhaps time itself bent in strange patterns. The house, then, might have been a point of convergence, a place where identities looped endlessly. Birth did not create new faces but reintroduced the old, drawn back into the present by forces unseen. This idea fascinated those who viewed time not as a straight line but as a circle, always folding back upon itself. Even more unsettling were theories of possession. According to these, the family was not reproducing at all. Instead, a single identity, or perhaps a collection of identities, returned again and again, inhabiting new bodies. What looked like inheritance might have been occupation. This explanation carried a darker weight. It suggested not only repetition but erasure, that each child born into the family never fully belonged to themselves, but to something waiting, ancient and insistent. Religious voices, though quieter, framed the mystery as punishment or proof. Some claimed the likeness revealed divine judgment, the family condemned to endless sameness as a symbol of sin unrepented. Others, more sympathetic, considered it a sign of grace, proof that the family had been chosen to embody continuity in a world of change. In both interpretations, the resemblance was not natural but spiritual, evidence of intervention beyond human comprehension. And then there were those who refused theories altogether. For them, the repetition was simply fact, needing no explanation. They argued that the obsession with solving the mystery missed the point. The photographs, the whispers, the uncanny sightings, these were reminders of the limits of human understanding. Not everything demanded reason. Some things, they insisted, must remain as they are, mysteries to unsettle, not puzzles to solve. But the greatest question, one that theories never fully answered, was why the family accepted it. Why did they not deny, explain, or resist? They must have noticed the resemblance themselves. They must have seen how each new child carried not only the likeness but the full face of those who came before. Yet they withdrew into silence. Their refusal to engage suggested either resignation or complicity. Did they believe themselves cursed? Chosen? Or did they, in some unspoken way, preserve the cycle intentionally? The unanswered questions multiplied. If likeness carried through generations, did memory also? Did the children remember, even faintly, the lives of their predecessors? Was their silence a shield, not only against gossip but against revealing knowledge that no one outside the family could understand? Or did they remain silent because words would fail, because no language could capture what they lived daily? The town, for its part, never pressed too far. Silence bred distance, and distance preserved peace. Yet as generations passed, the weight of mystery grew. When outsiders stumbled upon the story, in archives, in forgotten letters, in abandoned albums, they felt the same unease the town had long carried. To confront the photographs was to confront a possibility that unsettled time itself, that identity might not belong solely to the individual, but to something larger, something cyclical, something unrelenting. In the end, the mystery rests not only in the photographs but in the refusal of resolution. Theories offer scaffolding, but the structure remains hollow. Science falters, folklore wanders, religion divides, philosophy circles endlessly. None can hold the entirety of what the family embodied. And so the story remains incomplete, as if designed to resist conclusion. Yet perhaps that is its power. To stand before the photographs, to walk past the silent house, is to be reminded of what cannot be controlled: inheritance, time, memory, the unknown. In their repetition, the family embodied something deeply human: the fear that we are not unique, the suspicion that we are echoes rather than voices, reflections rather than originals. The photographs still exist. Some tucked into private collections, others hidden in archives, a few scattered through attics and forgotten boxes. Each carries the same weight, a face that has been seen before, and will perhaps be seen again. Each is a reminder that questions endure longer than answers, and that silence, sometimes, speaks louder than explanation. And so the story closes as it began, in a basement, with photographs of faces that should not match yet do. Faces that bind generations together, not through choice or chance, but through a mystery no theory can contain. The town lives on, the house still stands, and the whispers continue. What began as discovery ends as enigma, unresolved, unyielding, and unforgettable.